Department of Justice and Equality, National Disability Inclusion Strategy 2017 to 2021. Forward from Finian McGrath, TD. Minister of State with Special Responsibility for Disability Issues, July 2017. I am delighted in my capacity as Minister of State with Special Responsibility for Disability Issues to present the National Disability Inclusion Strategy for the years 2017 to 2021 inclusive. This strategy is a whole-of-government approach to improving the lives of people with disabilities. Both in a practical sense and also in creating the best possible opportunities for people with disabilities to fulfill their potential. One of my key priorities when I became Minister of State was to meet with as many people with disabilities as possible. For me, it was essential to learn firsthand about the challenges and practical difficulties that they face. It was also vitally important to hear about what people's real needs were and to get advice on what things would make a measurable difference in their lives. I have been inspired by the goals and achievements of the people I met, and am more determined than ever to realise the priorities agreed by the government and make the changes that are needed. Disability is an issue that will affect us all in our lifetimes. According to the 2011 census, there are almost 600,000 people living with a disability in Ireland. Many of us have family members, friends, or colleagues with disabilities. And in an ageing society, we are all likely to live to an age when we will experience disability ourselves. Disability is about all of us, and the strategy should be of interest to everyone. It is underpinned by a vision of an Irish society in which people with disabilities enjoy equal rights and opportunities. To participate in social and cultural life, can work if they want to do so, have choice and control over how they live their lives, and can reach their full potential. Since my appointment as Minister of State, I have said that ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, is one of my key goals. And even though the process is taking longer than I had hoped, I remain completely committed to this outcome. Before we ratify the Convention, enactment of new legislation and amendment of existing legislation is required to ensure obligations will be met upon entry into force for Ireland. Ratification of a convention before we have amended domestic legislation that contradicts it makes no sense, and does nothing to ensure compliance or to protect the people for whose benefit the convention exists. Considerable progress has already been made. The Disability Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2016, the primary purpose of which is to address the remaining legislation barriers to Ireland's ratification of the CRPD, was published prior to Christmas and completed second stage in February 2017. The work that remains to be done is outlined in the strategy, and I am working closely and determinedly with all of the stakeholders to ensure that the remaining barriers are removed without unnecessary delay. The inclusion strategy is the outcome of a broad and comprehensive consultation process that comprised 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 included an initial round of consultations, the aim of which was to identify the priority themes to be addressed in a new strategy. A second phase was then commenced to identify and agree specific objectives under each of the themes identified in Phase 1. Phase 3 focused on identifying precise and measurable actions and timescales for achievement of each of the objectives that emerged from Phase 2. For the last 12 months, I have been working with the National Disability Authority, NDA, and senior officials across multiple government departments to identify which of the actions generated in Phase 3 can be implemented over the next 4 years. These actions have the full backing of the Taoiseach and ministers through the Cabinet Committee on Social Policy and Public Service Reform. All of the identified initiatives have been developed to have the maximum beneficial impact for people who have disabilities. However, to my mind, there are a number that are clear priorities, not just because of the potential that they have to transform people's lives when fully implemented, but because when taken together, they have the power to promote a fundamental culture shift in relation to disability. By this, I mean that the initiatives, when they have moved off the pages of a document and become the established way of doing things, have the capacity to significantly impact on the way in which services support people with disabilities. All of us, people with disabilities and people without disabilities, will be the beneficiaries of this. Individually, I believe the following initiatives will, in their cumulative effect, be life-changing for very many people. Extension of Irish Sign Language remote interpretation service to evenings and weekends. Resourcing of the sign language interpretation service to increase the number of trained sign language and deaf interpreters. The establishment of a quality assurance and registration scheme for interpreters and ongoing professional training and development. Legislation that will ensure that all public bodies provide Irish Sign Language users with free interpretation when accessing or availing of their statutory services. Examination of the recommendations of the Make Work Pay Working Group, with a view to introducing meaningful reforms that make it financially worthwhile for a person with a disability to take up employment. Implementation of the comprehensive employment strategy for persons with disabilities, including an increase of the public service employment target from 3% to 6%. The arrangement of special public service competitions and the opening up of alternative recruitment channels. A review of transport supports to determine the type of cross-departmental transportation options that will best help people with a range of disabilities to get to work. And implementation of the most viable proposals. Development of proposals to address access to or affordability of necessary aids, appliances and assistive technologies required for everyday living. For those people with disabilities whose entry, retention or return to work could be jeopardized due to being unable to afford these items. Introduction of a scheme that will significantly reduce the notice time for travelling for mobility impaired customers requiring assistance. Development of proposals in relation to attaching conditions regarding wheelchair accessibility on passenger licensed services. Examination of the recommendations of the report of the Personalised Budgets Task Force, with a view to introducing the option of availing of a personal budget as one approach to individualised funding. Development of codes of practice to support implementation of the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act 2015. Full implementation of the access and inclusion model of supports for children with disabilities, to allow every child to participate meaningfully in the early childhood care and education scheme, and full implementation of the Transforming Lives programme with particular reference to advancing the Time to Move On agenda, decongregation. The New Directions programme reforming adult day services, and the move towards person-centred planning for residential and day services. I would like to thank everyone who contributed to and participated in the consultative process, including civil society organisations across the disability sector, individuals with lived experience of disability, the Disability Stakeholders Group, DSG, the National Disability Inclusion Strategy Steering Group, NDISSG, the NDA, the National Disability Strategy Interdepartmental Committee, and officials from a range of relevant government departments. Through my chairing of the NDISSG, I was able to observe firsthand how the strategy improved and took shape as a result of the collaboration and collegiate approach of stakeholders. And the incorporation of their incisive inputs and suggestions. Disability is the responsibility of every government minister, and that is why I have been working to ensure a whole-of-government approach is taken. However, It is not just the government that can be an agent of change. Organisations in the disability sector have a critical role to play in ensuring the strategy is a success. As individuals, there is an onus on us all to care about and engage with the issues and to be proactively involved in positive changes to the world we live in. Although departments and statutory bodies are responsible for implementing the actions in the strategy, I view the strategy as a collaborative effort. The best chance of success lies in us working together and not letting up until each disabled person in this country has the opportunity to fulfill his or her potential and lead a full and active life that is valued by society. Disability in Ireland. According to the 2011 census, 595,355 people reported having a disability in census 2011, which is equivalent to 13% of the population of Ireland. However, the National Disability Survey 2006, which uses a broader definition of disability and chronic illness, recorded a disability rate of 18%, comparable to other developed countries. As one would expect, disability is age-related and increases sharply with age. Three out of every 5 people aged over 60 years has at least one chronic condition. Living with a disability poses many complex challenges. In 2005, people with disabilities in Ireland had an employment rate of 32%, according to the OECD 2010. In 2011, following a period of challenging economic conditions, the employment rate for people with disabilities had fallen to less than 30%. More recently, an NDA commissioned analysis of data compiled under the Quarterly National Household Surveys 2010 to 2015 concerning employment transitions of people with disabilities shows that in the 20 to 59 age group, 31% of people with a disability are in paid employment, compared to 71% of those without a disability. People with disabilities are also more likely to work part-time if they are in employment. Among those at work, 1/3 of people with a disability are working part-time, compared to 1/5 of people without a disability. The chances of exiting employment are twice as high for someone with a disability compared to an otherwise identical individual without a disability. While those aged 20 to 24 are most likely to move into employment, those over the age of 45 with a disability have a considerably reduced opportunity of entering employment if not currently at work. All this being said, nearly half of all those with a disability in Ireland are either at work or are interested in work. NDA forthcoming. People with disabilities are more likely to live alone, and 42% live in a jobless household, putting them at high risk of poverty. Overall, people with disabilities experience high levels of consistent poverty. Families where the head of the household was not at work due to illness or disability with the exception of students, had the lowest average annual disposable income in 2014. This was €24,914 compared to €54,430 for those at work. This represents a 21% drop since 2009 compared to a 7% drop for those at work. People with disabilities have poorer educational participation and outcomes, thereby further reducing economic prospects, NDA. For instance, just 24.5% of people with a disability have completed third-level education, compared to 38.7% of the general population, Census 2011 figures. In 2010, 50% of people with a disability had not completed full second-level education, compared with 22% without a disability. In fact, among people with disabilities generally, 43% have not progressed beyond primary education. This compares with 19% of all adults. About a third of people with disabilities have been found to leave education before they intended to because of their disability or illness. Mainstreaming. For the last 15 years, it has been established government policy that mainstream public services include and serve people with disabilities. This is underpinned by the Disability Act 2005. Accordingly, a wide range of government departments are included in the strategy, and mainstream as well as dedicated disability services are incorporated. Other strategic developments. In conjunction with the policy of mainstreaming, a number of other significant developments in the Irish policy landscape are also relevant to improving the lives of people with disabilities, and these are reflected in the actions contained in the strategy. The comprehensive employment strategy for people with disabilities is aimed at improving employment participation and outcomes for people with disabilities. The Transforming Lives programme is dedicated to improving the delivery of health and social care services to people with disabilities. Arising out of the Value for Money and Policy Review of Disability Services in Ireland, 2012. Based on enshrining the principles of self-determination and autonomy in all service provision for those with disabilities. The Department of Health's report, A Vision for Change, takes a similar approach for persons with mental health difficulties. These and other developments sit against the backdrop of the CRPD. Which will be ratified as soon as we have ensured that all the legislation on the statute book complies with the Convention. We are not waiting for ratification, of course, to advance the aims and principles of the CRPD. And the National Disability Inclusion Strategy provides the means for doing so on an operational level. The Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures programme contains a number of commitments from across government that are relevant to children and young people with a disability. The goal of the National Strategy on Children and Young People's Participation in Decision-Making 2015 to 2020 is that children and young people, particularly those who are seldom heard, have a voice in their individual and collective everyday lives. The aim of the National Youth Strategy 2015 to 2020 is to enable all young people to realise their maximum potential, while protecting and supporting them as they transition from childhood to adulthood. Development of the strategy. The previous National Disability Strategy ran from 2013 to 2015, a period of time when the severest of economic and fiscal conditions applied, which frustrated implementation of the strategy. We now have an opportunity and an obligation to make up the lost ground against a backdrop of renewed economic growth, and to ensure that we address the real needs of persons with disabilities. Development of the new strategy began in 2015 when the Department of Justice and Equality, together with the NDA and the Interdepartmental Group, launched a consultation process in order to provide interested parties with the opportunity to make recommendations in proposed key areas, such as service provision, accommodation, health, employment, transport, and education. The consultations took the form of a three-stage process as follows. Phase 1. This phase commenced in mid-2015 and was an open call to people with disabilities, their families and disability organisations to respond to a suggested list of policy areas to be covered in the strategy. The themes agreed for inclusion in the strategy were education, employment, health and well-being, person-centred disability services, housing, transport and accessible places, equality and choice, and joined-up services. Phase 2. The aim of this phase was the identification and agreement of specific objectives under each of the themes identified in Phase 1. A provisional set of objectives was prepared by the NDA, and again, people with disabilities, their families and the disability sector were invited to give an input on the priority objectives that they would like to see achieved in the next 4 years. This stage of the consultation, which took place at the end of 2015, involved several regional meetings and an opportunity to send in written comments or to comment online. Phase 3, September 2016 to December 2016. Focused on identifying precise and measurable actions and timescales for achievement of each of the objectives that emerged from Phase 2. Following this phase, a draft proposal for a revised strategy was prepared by senior officials in collaboration with the DSG and was submitted to Government for approval on 30th of May 2017. The NDISSG comprises key government departments, the NDA and the DSG. The group is chaired by the Minister of State, and the Department of Justice and Equality provides secretariat functions to the group. The NDA is an independent statutory body with responsibility for providing information and advice to the Minister of State and to assist him in the coordination of national policy. The DSG comprises an independent chair, individuals with lived experience of disabilities, and representatives of the key disability umbrella bodies, including Centre for Independent Living, Disability Federation of Ireland, Federation of Voluntary Bodies, Mental Health Reform, As I Am Autism Spectrum, Brothers of Charity Services, Cheshire, Ireland, Deaf Here, Inclusion Ireland, Irish Association of Supported Employment, and National Council for the Blind Services. Monitoring and implementation. The strategy sets out key actions under each theme and objective, and indicates the relevant government departments responsible along with the timeframe for delivery. Where an action has a cross-sectoral or cross-departmental aspect, the lead department and other departments that have shared responsibilities are also identified. In addition, departments will include actions to be delivered via the agencies under their remit where appropriate. For example, many actions under the Department of Health will be undertaken by the Health Service Executive. This strategy can be regarded as a living document that will be reviewed periodically and will incorporate additional and revised actions as progress is made on the initial set of commitments it contains. The NDISSG will monitor the implementation of the strategy based on annual work plans and will meet 4 times a year or as directed by the Minister of State. Departments will progress the implementation and monitoring of relevant actions of the strategy at local level through their departmental consultative committees. In advance of each meeting, these consultative committees will submit progress reports to the NDA, which in turn will develop a briefing paper based on information received to help identify key themes and issues to inform discussion. In particular, information received will highlight areas of difficulty in implementation or cross-departmental issues. Solutions to which will become the focus of discussions at the NDISSG meetings. The Minister of State will, through the Cabinet Committee on Social Policy and Public Service Reform. Keep the Taoiseach and his Cabinet colleagues informed in relation to the work of the group on a regular basis. The strategy will therefore have the involvement of the Taoiseach and other ministers with social policy and public service reform functions. Whenever such involvement becomes necessary to remove blockages and keep all relevant parties informed. This will be particularly useful where there are cross-sectoral issues, as the Minister of State will be able to discuss the issues with his Cabinet colleagues. Ensuring cross-sectoral cooperation on issues from the top down. The Department of Justice and Equality will continue to provide the Secretariat function to the NDI-SSG and will also continue to chair the NDI-SSG where issues arising can be discussed and resolved. The voice of people with disabilities will continue to be heard throughout the monitoring and implementation process. Since the strategy is a living document, their continued input will be sought and recorded on an ongoing basis. A mid-term review and consultation meetings where departments will report on their commitments will also form a key part of the implementation process. The NDI-SSG will publish an annual report on progress made in each year, and a revised iteration of the strategy will be prepared following the mid-term review at the end of 2018. Outcome indicators. Implementation of the strategy will also be monitored in terms of outcomes for people with disabilities through a suite of indicators developed by the NDA and agreed by the NDI-SSG. The indicators will enable measurement of change in key areas addressed by the strategy and have been determined by data that is available at regular intervals. This includes longitudinal surveys such as Growing Up in Ireland and other statutory reports complemented by periodic surveys carried out by the NDA. The suite of outcome indicators will capture outcomes for people with disabilities under the high-level themes and broad objectives, insofar as that is feasible, rather than outcomes under each of the different actions to be taken in the annual implementation plan. For example, the outcome indicators will measure the employment rate of people with disabilities at the start and the end of the strategy period, and measure how that has changed relative to employment rates for non-disabled people over the period. Further information. Further information in relation to issues arising from this inclusion strategy may be obtained from Equality Division, Department of Justice and Equality, Bishop's Square, Redmond's Hill, Dublin 2, D02TD99, or via email to disabilityinbox@justice.ie. A copy of this inclusion strategy is available on www.justice.ie. Tá leagan Gaeilge den stratas seo ar fáil.